Hi there. This video is our last in a series of, our last series, I should say, in our course looking at issues related to agri-food. And this one is geared more towards charting a way forward for you as an individual in navigating a particular kind of system and structure. So, this agency and participation in agri-food systems is something we all have to kind of figure out. What are we going to do individually? What can we do to change the systems and the structures within which we are situated? And it helps to begin this discussion by considering the structure and agency pieces. All individual actions do happen within the context of a structure of some kind, whether or not we're aware of what that structure is. And what do we mean by structure? Mostly sets of rules, organizational structures, legal structures that apply to entire countries, you name it. We're actually embedded within different layers of structures. And so we have a tension between the agency of what we can do as individuals and the structural limitations, constraints, and rules that try to keep us in place or, at least within our lane. So we need to be aware of those structural constraints in order to use our agency. And one thing that the social theorist Anthony Giddens pointed out a long time ago is that we're not slaves to structure, that as agents, we can actually act back on the structure within which we exist. We can change the structure, and that's when he coined the term structuration. This idea that structure is always going through a process of change. And sometimes we can use our agency to change our structures. So I realize this is all pretty abstract stuff, and we will eventually come back down to the ground a little bit. But we have to start off with these sort of big philosophical questions and thinking about what we can actually do. Now, when we go and we look at the United States and a lot of Western societies, many in Europe and so forth, there's a culture of individuals, especially pronounced in the U.S. Uh, and so, with this culture, we emphasize the achievements of individuals. And unfortunately, when individuals fail because of structural reasons, that is, there are rules or constraints in place that prevent somebody from succeeding, we often ignore that and we blame it all on the individual. So that is something we need to be on the lookout for, especially when we're considering social equity issues as part of sustainability. So the danger of individualism, many problems, of course, have a much deeper cause found in the system or the structure in which we exist. And so actually there are oftentimes structural failings in place that lead to many individuals finding it difficult to achieve their goals or succeed by some standard. So ignoring structure means limited solutions. So when we're trying to solve problems, like in the case of agri-food problems, and we can't just look at individual choice. We have to look at changing the structures and changing the rules and changing the laws, changing the ways organizations operate, changing communities. So finding and addressing structural problems is vital to success, actually. It's not enough to just change individuals' attitudes. And when it comes to the environment, we can stress individual action, uh, but we really we have to be aware of the structural constraints, but personal responsibility also cannot be avoided. We can't say, well, the structure is broken, therefore you can't blame me. Okay, well, you can go too far with that. You can disabuse yourself of all, uh, absolve yourself of all personal responsibility, and that's something we also want to avoid that, right? That's just going a little too far. But, we also need to recognize that we're not superheroes, and even if we were, there are constraints that might prevent us from achieving our goals. So, what do you mean by personal responsibility? We might try to become aware of ourselves. If we're trying to exercise our personal responsibility. And in doing so, it helps to consider a sociological concept here called phenomenology. And this is an interesting, I know it's kind of an ugly word, kind of a piece of jargon, but it's useful. It's just packed with meaning. And it mostly refers to the daily routines, the patterns of our own individual lives, the actions we take on a routine basis. In fact, we go through much of our lives in something that we might call autopilot. If we refer to the theory of Alfred Schutz, who theorized much of this concept. And so we go through our days, oftentimes unthinkingly, just doing what we've always done, usually as a product of our socialization and so forth. And as a result, if we have bad habits, unfortunately, we tend to repeat those habits quite often. Sometimes habits are hard to break. Uh, but, sometimes we become aware. We have these moments where we wake up, we realize that the way we've been doing things, going through the motions, is not necessarily what we want to be doing anymore. Maybe you somehow wound up becoming a smoker, but you realize, this is really bad for your health, and even though it's going to be difficult, you want to make a change. And a lot of times, just becoming aware of a problem with yourself by itself is not enough. It's often very difficult to change these habits once we form them. So, the question is, can we change and should we change? And, when we do, you can sort of ask what social norms, what sort of structures and systems are in place that led me to behave in that way in the first place, and, can I change the system or the structural norms, the social norms, the structural rules? Is there anything I can do to fix that so that somebody else doesn't go through this same, kind of challenge? So when you're trying to make a personal change to improve yourself, right? When we think about agri-food changes, we're usually talking about changing patterns related to the way we eat and the way we buy food, or maybe the way we even grow food. And if you don't grow food, well, maybe that's something you should change too. We should take up gardening, take up agriculture in some level, become acquainted with what it's like to produce food on some level so you can appreciate the amount of energy and work that goes into that activity. But there's nothing that says you have to go it alone. If you really want to improve yourself, it does help to join groups that will support you. No human being is a lone wolf unless they really strive to be. Um, One of the reasons why sociology is such a great field is that it recognizes the fact that most humans exist in groups. And if you really want to make changes, you can associate yourself with other individuals who are trying to make the same changes. So, if you want to become a vegetarian, you don't want to hang out with a bunch of people who eat steak. You're going to be torturing yourself. If you yourself find steak delicious, but you want to give that up, you want to find people who also maybe enjoy going to a vegan restaurant, just as a for instance. And so groups can help create new norms that we can live by and at least remove some of the temptation to act in ways that we don't want to act. Peer pressure, right? That can work in a good way or a bad way. And so groups can also help us identify ways to improve and blaze new pathways. So surround yourself with the people you yourself want to be. Remember Heberlein's critique of cognitive solutions, this idea that we can solve problems just by changing people's attitudes. Now, there is nothing wrong with trying to, initiate some kind of enlightenment in individuals, get them thinking more progressively. But we need to pay attention to this critique, the idea that new information will automatically change attitudes. So you can't just expect people to change because it's the rational thing to do. If that were the case, there wouldn't be any smokers because most people are pretty much aware of the dangers and the risks that go with smoking, but there are other factors involved that are beyond reason and beyond enlightenment, right? Things like addiction, things like emotion. So, the idea that the best way to change behavior is to just pummel people with information to change their attitudes is a misguided starting point, right? We have to think of solutions that really go beyond the cognitive fix. And Heberlein also provides a few insights. And looking at his theory, he looks at these concepts of consistency, identity, and direct experience. When we think about where our own attitudes originated, they have a lot to do with our experience, right? The things we've gone through kind of make us who we are. our identity, which has to do with who we think we are as individuals, which isn't unrelated to direct experience. And then consistency, right? We like to have attitudes and behaviors that we engage in, and our identity and our experiences all have some level of consistency, or we really experience a certain amount of dissonance when those things don't line up. And it is harder to change attitudes that are anchored in your identity, right? So if for some reason your identity is bound up with things like your diet or your food habits in some way, it's going to be hard to change those, right? Or you form a new identity. Sometimes you have to remake yourself, right, if you really want to make changes. Um, so situational forces play a factor as well. Right? So those can be positive or negative forces, sanctions we call them, right? Things we encounter in our daily lives, things that may have nothing to do with reason or rationale. If you're trying to give up carbohydrates, right, to lose weight, but you walk by a bakery and you get that smell of fresh bread and your stomach starts to growl, that's a situational force that few people could resist, right? It's just a very powerful emotional sort of base instinct appeal that it's hard to ignore. And those are things we have to take into consideration too. We as individuals are very complex, right? Our psychology, our social environment, these are all things we have to become aware of if we're trying to improve ourselves and become more responsible citizens, consumers, and make better choices, right? We should also think about community, right? What is your community like? We don't just live in groups, but our groups exist within a broader community of some kind. And we can always choose to move. We could live in communities that promote sustainability, and a lot of times people do seek out new environs. They'll move to a place because they think they want to be a part of the culture that's there, the lifestyle, the maybe even the natural environment, the way things are. People like to have environmental amenities like mountains and lakes. But, they also move to places because they think their values line up with the culture of the place. So we need to think about and identify communities that match what we believe in if we are mobile, right? A lot of times we're not mobile. We want to stay put. We want to live where maybe we grew up in a place, we have a certain amount of attachment, and we don't want to leave. So then we have to think about what we can do to promote the norms of sustainability, things that line up with our values within our current community. And that may mean going up against a certain amount of resistance, right? But if you encounter resistance, remember the saying, you can catch more flies with honey than vinegar. So if you really want to change your community, you need to lead by example. And that example should set something that's attractive in place. People should want to follow you, not feel compelled. The questions we can ask about community are: can we structure our communities to make sustainability automatic, cheap, and convenient? If you want people to have healthy lifestyles, let's say we want people to ride bikes because it doesn't use any fossil fuel, it's good for the environment, it's good for our health. Something you can do in your community to promote that is really advocate for safe, clear bike paths, right? People who don't like to feel like they're risking their life and limb to go for a bike ride, but a lot of communities, that's exactly what happens because the road traffic is bad and there's really no place for bikes. And that's a problem with structure, not the individual. So even if somebody wanted to ride a bike, they may be up against a lot of obstacles. I experience that a lot of times as a runner. It's easy to be a sustainable citizen if it doesn't require hard sacrifices. So, if you have to drive 50 miles to get food that is, organic or sustainable, or, there just aren't easy choices, it's less likely to happen. So, what can you do to promote, for instance, a farmer's market in your community? Can you help coordinate something like that? Or maybe a CSA, right? Community Supported Agriculture. If those things don't exist in your community, maybe think about ways that you can help bring those things about. Ultimately, though, we do have a lot of individual choices to think about. And we've given you a lot of things to think about over the course of our time, looking at food, society, and the environment. And so we think about choices around what we buy. We've talked about ethical consumerism, how are things made with regard to labor, treatment of animals, fair trade, are farmers being paid well, corporate social responsibility, are the food businesses that we vote for with our dollars, are they doing things to promote sustainability and protect workers and animals, or what's going on behind the veil? Are there alternative networks, right? If we don't like the industry that maybe is most easily and conveniently available, maybe we can explore some alternative networks. Maybe those are online, maybe they're on the ground. Maybe we can do something to bring those about ourselves. We also have to think about our individual choices politically. How do we vote? What kind of politicians do we want? What kind of policies and initiatives do we hope to see put into action both locally as well as regionally and nationally and so forth? And of course, you can get involved in politics and you can join groups that are also politically active. Ultimately, how can we act, right? What kind of direct action and involvement can we become involved with? Yeah, and then just what are we going to eat? Because when we're voting about the agri-food system, our habits in terms of the way we eat are going to have a lot to do with uh, consequences. All right, thank you. We have another follow-up video for this that's going to leave us with some parting questions on what we can do if we want to make some better individual choices. Thanks.